The town stood quiet and untouched, its dusty streets and weathered buildings bearing the weight of time. It was a place that had long since slipped from the memory of most, a forgotten relic of the past. That is, until the town was resurrected, reborn from the ashes of decades of neglect, restored with painstaking care and effort. The crumbling walls and sagging roofs were made whole again, brought back to life as a historical monument, a piece of Americana preserved for the sake of curiosity and heritage. But beneath this new veneer of restoration, there was something that remained hidden, something that had lingered for over half a century, patiently waiting to be unearthed. The church, once a symbol of faith for the people who had called this place home, stood at the heart of it all, and it was there, deep beneath its stone floors, in a forgotten basement, that the town's most unsettling secret was waiting to be discovered. It's an odd thing, this pull of the past. Some places seem to carry their history with them, like a weight on their shoulders, even as the world around them changes. In the case of this town, the abandonment in 1949 had left a void that no amount of restoration could ever fill. What happened here all those years ago? Why did an entire community just vanish overnight, leaving their homes, their livelihoods, everything behind without a trace? For years, rumors had circulated, whispers of strange occurrences, of odd rituals, of something lurking in the shadows of the town's past that had driven its people to leave. But no one knew the truth. Not really. Some said it was a plague that swept through the town. Others claimed it was the work of a criminal mastermind. But no one ever had the full picture. All anyone could do was speculate, filling the silence with their own theories, their own dark imaginings. And now, as the town was brought back to life, it seemed as if the truth, whatever it might be, was finally within reach. But what the workers, historians, and curious visitors didn't know was that the act of restoring this ghost town, of shining a light into its dark corners, would uncover something that would change everything. It would be a discovery that would shatter the rumors and the speculations, replacing them with a truth so unsettling, so deeply troubling, that it would force everyone to question everything they thought they knew about this place. It all began innocently enough. The church had been the focal point of the town's revival. It was the one building that had remained largely intact, preserved by the very nature of its sacred purpose. For the most part, it had avoided the ravages of time, its structure holding strong despite years of neglect. And so, when the restoration project began, it was the church that received the most attention. Its steeple rose proudly above the town, its bell tower a silent sentinel watching over the desolate streets. The workmen who arrived to begin the repairs marveled at the craftsmanship, at the intricate stained glass windows that still shimmered despite the grime that had collected on them over the years. They worked in hushed reverence, aware that they were touching something sacred, something that held the memories of a town lost to time. As they began to clear away the debris, they uncovered relics of the past, olden books, rusted tools, faded altar cloths. These were the remnants of a bygone era, a time when the church had been full of life, full of people. But as the work continued, something else caught their attention, something strange, something that didn't belong. Down in the church's basement, beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, they found an old door hidden from view. It wasn't part of any blueprint, and no one had ever mentioned it before. The door was locked, its surface worn smooth by years of neglect. But it wasn't the lock that drew their attention. It was the sense of mystery, the nagging feeling that something important lay beyond it. What could possibly be hidden there, beneath the very foundation of the church? Why had no one mentioned this door before? With a mixture of curiosity and caution, the workers pried open the door, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the earth below. The air down there was thick with the scent of old stone and forgotten memories. And as they descended into the darkness, the sense of unease grew stronger. They had no idea what they were about to uncover, but they could feel it, the presence of something that had been waiting for them, hidden beneath the surface all these years. It was as though the town itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. The deeper they went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as though the weight of the town's history was pressing down on them. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a small room, barely more than a closet, really, but the space was filled with something that couldn't be ignored. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were strange, old objects, artifacts, relics, things that had no place in a typical church basement. Old books, weathered and fragile, sat alongside jars of unknown substances, some of them sealed with wax. There were symbols etched into the stone walls, symbols that were unfamiliar to anyone who had studied the town's history. But it wasn't just the objects that caught their attention. It was a feeling, the overwhelming sense that they had stumbled upon something that had been deliberately hidden. This wasn't just a forgotten corner of the church. This was something else, something far more unsettling. And then there was the box. It was small, made of tarnished metal, and it had been carefully tucked away in a corner, almost as if someone had tried to bury it from view. The workers carefully lifted it, and as they did, they couldn't help but wonder what it contained. What secrets did this box hold? Who had placed it there, and why? The box was sealed tightly, its lock intricate and old. It had been untouched for years, its presence almost forgotten by time. But now, as it was brought back into light, the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. This wasn't just a box. It was a key to a mystery that had been waiting to be unlocked for over 50 years. When the box was finally opened, the workers found themselves staring at something that defied explanation. Inside, wrapped in old cloth, was a bundle of items, objects that seemed both ancient and strangely out of place. There were journals, their pages yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. There were photographs, some torn and others well-preserved, showing faces of people who had once lived in the town. And then there were the letters, handwritten notes that seemed to speak of events that had never been recorded in the town's official history. But what struck them the most was the tone of these documents. There was a sense of fear, a sense of urgency in the words, as though the people who had written them knew that something was coming, something they couldn't stop. And in the midst of it all, there was a letter, a single letter that would change everything. It was addressed to no one in particular, a private missive, perhaps never meant to be read by anyone other than the person who had written it. It was from the town's pastor, a man who had disappeared along with the rest of the town's residents. The letter spoke of strange occurrences, of whispers in the night, of visions that tormented the pastor's mind. It spoke of a growing darkness that had taken hold of the town, a darkness that was more than just superstition. The pastor wrote of a force, something beyond human understanding, that was closing in on the town. And in the final words of the letter he wrote, "Whatever happens, it is too late to stop it." The workers had uncovered a truth far more terrifying than they could have imagined. The rumors, the whispers, the tales of supernatural occurrences. They were not just stories. They were warnings. Something had happened in this town, something that had forced its people to leave, something that had driven them to the edge of fear and madness. And now, as the town was brought back to life, that same force seemed to be stirring once again, waiting to be revealed. The discovery of the letter marked the beginning of a journey into the heart of the town's mystery, a journey that would unearth secrets long buried, secrets that would forever change the way the world looked at this once-forgotten place. But what lay ahead was something none of them could have prepared for, a truth so unsettling, so incomprehensible, that it would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about the world and about themselves. In the silence of the basement, with the box now open and its contents spread out before them, the workers felt the weight of the past pressing down on them. They had uncovered something that no one had ever expected to find. The rumors had been only the beginning. What they had discovered in that basement was the key to a much larger mystery, a mystery that would lead them into the depths of fear and darkness, where the lines between the real and the supernatural blurred, and where the truth was far stranger and far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The restoration of the ghost town was a monumental task, one that required more than just the hands of skilled workers. It demanded a reverence for history, a respect for memories that had been buried beneath the layers of time. For the people who undertook this project, it wasn't merely about rebuilding old walls and patching up roofs. It was about breathing life back into a place that had been lost, a place that had slipped from the world's attention for so long that it had been left to fade into obscurity. Every stone that was lifted, every beam that was replaced, was an act of resurrection, a chance to recover something of value from the past. The town was a relic, a time capsule frozen in the moment of its abandonment in 1949, and now, after decades of silence, it was slowly awakening. But the church, the centerpiece of the town, was where the most attention was focused. It had been the heart of the town, a place where people gathered not just for religious services, but for a sense of community. The church had been the soul of the town, its bell ringing every Sunday morning, its pews filled with people seeking solace, guidance, and connection. The church had seen births and deaths, weddings and funerals, the ebb and flow of life that made a town feel alive. When the town had been abandoned, the church had been left behind as a mute witness to its people's sudden disappearance. And though the walls had stood strong, the silence inside had been suffocating. As the restoration team moved into the church, there was a palpable sense of awe. To them, this was not just a building. It was a symbol, a piece of history that demanded respect. They worked carefully, removing decades of dust, peeling away layers of grime and neglect. Each step they took seemed to echo the weight of the years, and every restored detail felt like a step closer to uncovering the story of what had happened here. The team was methodical in their approach, taking their time to preserve every detail, from the faded stained glass windows to the intricate carvings on the altar. The church's interior was a tapestry of memories, and they were determined to restore it to its former glory. But it wasn't just the aesthetic beauty of the church that intrigued the workers. It was the mystery that surrounded it. There was something unsettling about this place, something that seemed to linger in the air, something that couldn't be explained away by the passage of time. The church, after all, was not just a building. It had been the site of something far darker, something that had never been fully understood. The workers couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something important, something that had been hidden away for far too long. As they carefully restored the walls and cleared away the debris, they began to uncover remnants of the past, artifacts that had been left behind when the town was abandoned. Old hymn books, worn and frayed, lay scattered across the floor. The pages, yellow with age, were still legible, filled with the music and prayers that had once filled the air. There were rusted tools and broken pews, remnant of the everyday life that had once flourished here. These objects, while fascinating, were not what the workers had been searching for. They were just relics, tokens of a time that had long since passed. It was a feeling of the place, the weight of its history, that intrigued them most. And then, in the midst of the restoration work, something strange happened. A worker, clearing away debris near the back of the church, discovered something hidden behind a large, rotting beam. At first, it seemed like nothing, just an old, forgotten doorway, partially obscured by dust and cobwebs. It was nothing special, nothing that would catch anyone's attention. But as the worker pushed away the debris and cleared the way, it became clear that this door had been deliberately hidden. It wasn't part of the church's original design. No one had mentioned it in the blueprints. No one had spoken of it before. It was as if it had been deliberately concealed, its existence erased from the collective memory of the town. The discovery of the door sparked a wave of curiosity among the restoration team. What could be behind it? Why had it been hidden for so long? Some of the workers were skeptical, dismissing it as just another forgotten corner of the church, another piece of the town's history that had been lost to time. But others felt a sense of unease, as if the door were a symbol of something more, something waiting to be uncovered. There was an odd feeling in the air, a sense of anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to come out. The door itself was old, its surface smooth and worn from years of neglect. The lock was rusted, its intricate design barely visible under the layers of dirt and decay. The workers tried to open it, but the lock refused to budge. It was as though the door was unwilling to let them in, unwilling to give up its secrets. They tried again and again, each failed attempt adding to the sense of mystery. There was something about this door, something that made it different from the rest of the church. It was as if it were guarding something that had been deliberately hidden from view. After hours of trying to force the door open, one of the workers finally managed to pry it loose. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness below. The air that rushed up from the stairwell was cold, damp, and thick with the scent of mildew. It was as though they had uncovered a hidden part of the church, a space that had been sealed off from the world for decades. The darkness below seemed to beckon them, drawing them in, even as a sense of unease settled over the group. They stood at the top of the stairs, unsure whether to descend or turn back. It was then that the team realized that they weren't just restoring a building. They were stepping into something far deeper, something that had been waiting for them all along. The church, once a place of worship and community, had now become a portal to the past, a threshold between the world of the living and the mysteries that lay hidden beneath. It was no longer just a building. It was a time capsule, a vessel of forgotten memories, secrets, and histories that had been buried for too long. The decision to descend into the darkness was not made lightly, but the pull of curiosity, the desire to understand what had been hidden away, was too strong to ignore. With cautious steps, the workers descended the staircase, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. They could no longer see the light of day, could no longer feel the warmth of the sun. All they had was the faint glow of their flashlights and the heavy weight of history pressing down on them. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a small room, no bigger than a storage closet. But what they found in that room would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The shelves were lined with old, forgotten objects, artifacts that seemed out of place, objects that didn't belong in a church basement. There were books, but these were not the sacred texts one would expect to find. These books were old and worn, their pages yellowed with age. They were filled with strange symbols, symbols that the workers could not recognize. Some of the books were bound in materials they couldn't identify, leather that had been tanned in a way that was foreign to them. They were objects of mystery, relics of a time that no one could explain. And there were jars, too, jars filled with strange, unidentifiable substances. Some were sealed tightly, their contents hidden from view, while others had been opened, their lids long gone. The jars were filled with liquids that glowed faintly in the dark, casting an eerie light across the room. There was something unsettling about them, something that made the workers feel as though they were intruding on a secret, something that had been hidden away for a reason. The room seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as though the objects on the shelves were alive, waiting for something or someone to awaken them. The air was thick with the weight of these forgotten things, and the workers could feel the tension rising. The sense of unease, which had started with the discovery of the hidden door, was now palpable. They had uncovered something important, but they didn't yet understand what it was. As they continued to explore the room, one of the workers stumbled upon something that would change everything, a small metal box. Tucked away in a corner, its surface tarnished and worn. The box was heavier than it looked, and when it was opened, the workers found themselves staring at a collection of objects that would make their blood run cold. Among them were faded letters, photographs of people they didn't recognize, and strange artifacts that seemed too bizarre to explain. But what caught their attention the most was a letter written by the town's pastor, a man who had disappeared along with the rest of the town's people in 1949. The letter was filled with cryptic, unsettling words that seemed to hint at something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The pastor spoke of visions and forces that were beyond human understanding. He wrote of a growing darkness that had taken root in the town, a darkness that had driven the townspeople to the edge of madness. And in the final words of the letter, he wrote, "Whatever happens, it is too late to stop it." The workers stood in silence, the weight of the discovery settling on them like a heavy cloak. The story of the town's sudden disappearance was one wrapped in mystery, a tale that had been passed down through hushed whispers and half-remembered stories, each one adding another layer to the fog of uncertainty. For years, the town had stood frozen in time, its buildings slowly eroding and its once vibrant streets now only home to wind and the occasional curious traveler. The town's abandonment in 1949 was not an event that had been well documented, but the people who lived there had not left quietly. The question that lingered in the air was simple, yet it haunted the survivors and descendants of the vanished town for generations. What happened to them? What could have driven an entire community, families, friends, neighbors, to pack up their lives and leave in the dead of night without a single trace, without leaving any clear explanation behind? At first glance, the town's history seemed simple enough. An idyllic place nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, a picture-perfect community untouched by the troubles of the outside world. The town had been founded in the late 1800s, and for decades it had prospered. It had everything a small town could need: a schoolhouse, a general store, a post office, a church, everything that created a sense of stability and belonging. The people who lived there were proud of their town, proud of its simple yet solid way of life. They had no reason to believe their world would ever change. But that was before the disappearances began. The first signs of trouble were small, almost imperceptible at first. Cattle began to die under mysterious circumstances. Healthy, strong animals found lifeless in the fields, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways, their eyes wide with fear. At first, it was dismissed as bad luck or some kind of disease that had swept through the herd. But as the weeks passed, more animals began to die, and the circumstances surrounding their deaths grew more bizarre. Some of the cattle were found with strange markings on their skin, symbols that no one could recognize. Others had been drained of blood in an inexplicable manner. Whispers began to circulate about strange figures that had been seen lurking at the edges of the forest, figures that seemed to vanish as quickly as they were spotted. The strange death of the animals were followed by a series of even more unsettling events. There were reports of strange sounds, screeches and howls, that echoed through the forest at night. People began to hear voices, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, voices that no one could trace. And then there were the sightings, shadows moving in the corners of people's eyes, figures in the distance that no one could explain. Those who lived in the town started to feel as though they were being watched, as though something unseen was lurking just beyond their perception, waiting for them to let down their guard. It was around this time that the town's pastor, a man known for his calm and measured demeanor, began to act strangely. He had always been a comforting presence, a steady hand guiding the community through times of hardship. But now he seemed distant, distracted. He spoke of visions, of voices calling to him in the night, and of a growing darkness that was slowly seeping into the town. He became more and more withdrawn, retreating to the church to pray, or to sit in the quiet of his study, muttering to himself as though caught in a fevered dream. His sermons grew darker, filled with warnings of a coming storm, a storm not of weather but of something far more terrifying. The townspeople began to notice a change in him, but no one quite knew what to make of it. Some grew fearful, others grew sympathetic, but all of them sensed that something was terribly wrong. As the pastor's behavior grew more erratic, the strange occurrences around the town began to intensify. The whispers in the night grew louder, and more people reported seeing strange figures in the woods. Figures that seemed to watch in the shadows, never approaching, never speaking, but always present. The sense of unease that had settled over the town began to spread, infecting the people's every thought and action. It was as though the very air in the town had changed, thickened, become heavier with the weight of something unnatural. At the same time, the town's population began to dwindle. Families that had lived there for generations began to leave, packing their belongings and leaving behind their homes without explanation. Some said they were leaving for better opportunities elsewhere. Others claimed they were running from something they couldn't explain. Those who remained behind grew nervous, their suspicions mounting with each passing day. Something was happening to their town, something they couldn't understand, and it seemed to be driving the people away. By the time the end of 1949 arrived, the town was nearly empty. The streets were eerily quiet, and the once bustling marketplace was nothing more than a ghost of its former self. Those who remained behind, mostly the elderly, the sick, and a few families who had nowhere else to go, could only watch as their neighbors disappeared one by one. It was as though a great wave of fear had swept through the town, carrying everyone with it, leaving only those who could not escape or were too terrified to move. And then, one night it happened. In the span of a few hours, the last remaining families packed their things and fled the town, leaving their homes as they had found them, untouched, with dinner tables set, beds unmade, and doors unlocked. There were no goodbyes, no explanations, just the eerie sound of footsteps fading into the night. The town was abandoned, its population gone without a trace, and the mystery of their disappearance would haunt the world for decades to come. In the years that followed, rumors began to spread. Some believed the town had been struck by a terrible plague, one so swift and deadly that the people had no choice but to leave before they too succumbed to its grasp. Others suggested that the town had been the site of a mass exodus, driven by some unexplained force, an unnatural fear, or an unseen threat that had driven everyone to leave in a blind panic. Still, others whispered of a more sinister explanation, that the town had been abandoned as a result of a terrible crime, one so heinous that the people had been forced to flee to escape its consequences. But no one could say for sure. No one knew what had really happened, and the answer seemed to slip further and further out of reach as the years went by. In the decades since the town's abandonment, its name had become little more than a footnote in local history. The land surrounding it had been reclaimed by nature, with trees and vines creeping up the walls of the old buildings, slowly erasing the signs of human life. Few people visited the site, and fewer still knew its true story. The mystery of the town had faded into legend, a forgotten tale told around campfires or shared in passing conversations. But even as the town's name slipped from the public's memory, those who knew the story couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something important, something that had been deliberately hidden. It was this mystery, the question of why the town had disappeared and what had truly happened to its people, that continued to draw people back to the site, even after so many years. Historians, journalists, and curious adventurers all came seeking answers, but no one had ever been able to uncover the truth. The town was still haunted by its past, its empty streets a silent testament to the unanswered questions that lingered in the air. It wasn't until the restoration project began that anyone would come close to solving the mystery. The town, once a place of bustling life, was now being brought back into the light. The restoration team was determined to preserve its history, to restore its buildings to their former glory, and to tell the story of a town lost time. But as they began to dig into the church's history, as they started to peel back the layers of dust and neglect, they realized that the answers they were seeking weren't buried in the past. They were buried beneath the very ground they were standing on. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the story of this town wasn't one of simple abandonment. There was something deeper, something darker at work, something that had driven an entire community to flee in the dead of night. And as the restoration team began to unravel the town's hidden past, they would discover a truth so unsettling that it would forever change the way they viewed the town, and the mystery of why it had been abandoned. The rumors, the whispers, the eerie tales of strange occurrences, they were all part of a larger story, a story that had been waiting to be told. And now, finally, it was time to face it. As the restoration of the old town pressed on, an unspoken tension began to coil around the team of workers. What had begun as a routine project to revive the fading remnants of history was slowly morphing into something much more than they could have ever anticipated. The church, with its quiet yet imposing presence, had been the focus of their efforts, but it was a discovery in its basement that would change everything. What began as a simple exploration of an old, forgotten room would soon unlock a Pandora's box of hidden truths. Truths that had been buried for decades, sealed away under layers of dust and silence. The discovery was not only unsettling, but was a key that would slowly unravel the mysteries that had surrounded the town's abandonment. It was late in the afternoon when the workers first made the discovery. After several days of clearing debris, lifting beams, and sifting through the remnants of the past, one of the workers, a man named Peter, noticed something odd at the back of the church's basement. It was a faint, almost imperceptible draft of cold air. He had been working in the far corner, near the base of the stone foundation, when he felt it, a sudden chill that seemed out of place. Curious, he inspected the walls and floor, running his hands over the rough stone. After a few minutes of searching, he noticed something peculiar. One of the stones in the far wall looked slightly different. It was ever so slightly misaligned with the rest, as though it had been placed there deliberately to hide something. Peter's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't one to believe in superstitions, but something about this felt wrong. His instincts, the ones that had served him well in his years as a builder, told him that there was something hidden here. The wall, though solid and seemingly untouched by time, had a secret. It wasn't just a wall. It was a door. Peter, unsure what he might find, decided to call the others over. They gathered around him, unsure of what to make of the discovery. The stone was heavy, the kind of stone used in ancient constructions, and it would have taken considerable effort to move it. As they carefully examined the area, one of the workers, a seasoned archaeologist named Sarah, made a suggestion. "Perhaps it's an old burial vault," she said, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Sometimes churches had hidden crypts, vaults where they kept the remains of important townspeople or artifacts they wanted to preserve. Peter wasn't convinced. He had worked with old buildings before and had never come across anything like this. The idea of a hidden crypt seemed too simple, too easy. This felt more deliberate, more secretive. After a moment of hesitation, he and the rest of the crew made the decision to pry the stone loose. It took time, more time than they had expected. But after hours of careful effort, the stone was finally dislodged. The air that rushed in as the door swung open was thick, musty, and cold, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. It was a smell that seemed to sink into bones, a smell that carried with it the weight of years, of centuries, of secrets that had been locked away for far too long. Beneath the door was a narrow staircase leading into the darkness. The team was hesitant at first. None of them had expected to find anything beneath the church, least of all a hidden chamber. The darkness below seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though it was alive, waiting for them. Sarah, the archaeologist, was the first to volunteer to descend. She had worked on excavation sites all over the world and had faced countless unknowns in her career, but something about this place unsettled her. Still, the lure of discovery was too strong. With a flashlight in hand, she led the way down the stone steps, her footsteps echoing softly in the oppressive silence. The others followed closely behind, their faces tense with a mixture of excitement and fear. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room. It was cramped, the walls closing in on them from all sides. The air felt thicker here, heavier, as though the space itself was imbued with some kind of energy that made it hard to breathe. The room was filled with shelves, each one sagging under the weight of objects that had been left undisturbed for decades. Most of the items were covered in dust, and many of them were old, their materials deteriorating with time. But despite the age of the objects, there was something incredibly unsettling about the room. It didn't feel like a storage space or an archive. It felt like a vault, a place where things had been hidden away on purpose, a place that had been sealed off from the world, kept from the prying eyes of history. As they moved further into the room, their flashlights flickering over the shelves, the objects on them began to take shape. There were books, thick leather-bound tomes that appeared to be more than mere texts of scripture. Some of the books were heavily inscribed with symbols that no one could recognize, the markings strange and otherworldly. Others were written in languages that none of the team could understand, their pages yellowed and brittle from age. These were not the types of books one would expect to find in a church basement. These were something else entirely, something darker. But it wasn't just the books that caught their attention. The shelves also held a collection of strange artifacts, jars filled with liquids that glowed faintly in the dark, objects wrapped in cloth, and relics that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. There were masks, grotesque and unsettling in design, and strange implements, tools that seemed to belong to some kind of ritual, tools that had no place in a church. Some of the items were clearly ancient, their materials unlike anything they had ever seen. As they carefully inspected these items, their unease grew. What had been stored here, hidden from the rest of the town, for so many years. The room felt like it was holding its breath, as though waiting for something to happen. And then, tucked away in the far corner, they found it, the box. It was small, made of tarnished metal, and its surface was covered in scratches and wear. It looked like an object that had been handled many times, but not for a long time. The team gathered around it, unsure what they might find inside. The lock on the box was intricate, old, and stubborn. It took several minutes of careful work before they were able to unlock it and open the lid. The box creaked open, its hinges protesting with a low groan. Inside, there were papers, old and yellowed, with writing that was barely legible. As they carefully unrolled the first sheet, their eyes widened. It was a letter. The letter, written in the pastor's hand, began with a cryptic warning, one that immediately set the tone for everything that followed. The pastor spoke of strange events that had begun to unfold in the town, events that no one could explain. He described the first signs of trouble, strange noises, figures in the woods, and a growing sense of unease that seemed to have taken root in the hearts of the people. The letter spoke of something darker, something that had been awakened in the town, something that was beyond human understanding. The pastor wrote of visions, of whispers in the night that seemed to come from the very walls of the church. He spoke of a force and entity that had begun to make its presence felt, a force that was growing stronger with each passing day. But it wasn't just the pastor's words that made the letter so unsettling, it was the tone. The pastor's handwriting, once neat and controlled, had become erratic, frantic. His words were filled with fear, a fear that grew more palpable with each sentence. In the final lines of the letter, the pastor wrote, Whatever happens, it is too late to stop it. The darkness is coming and it will consume us all. The workers stood in silence, the weight of the letter settling over them like a thick fog. What had they stumbled upon? The contents of the room, the strange artifacts, the pastor's words. It all pointed to something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The town's abandonment, the disappearance of its people, the dark forces that had driven them away. It was all connected. And now, as the team stood in the dimly lit basement, surrounded by relics of a past they couldn't understand, the chilling truth was beginning to take shape. The secrets of the town's past were buried here, in this room, hidden from the world for over 50 years. The discovery in the basement had only just begun to reveal the extent of the mystery. The letter was the first piece of the puzzle, but it was clear that the answers they sought were much deeper, much darker than anyone could have guessed. The town story was not one of simple abandonment. It was a story of a community that had been torn apart by forces beyond their control, forces that had taken hold of their minds and their lives. And as they continued to explore the church's hidden depths, the workers would soon learn that the horrors of the past were not as distant as they seemed. They were still alive, still waiting just beneath the surface. The discovery in the church basement had set a cascade of emotions and thoughts into motion. The team had uncovered a trove of unsettling relics, strange artifacts, and most crucially, a letter from the town's pastor, warning of an impending darkness that seemed to have taken hold of the town in its final days. What began as a simple restoration project had now become something far more sinister, a search for answers that seemed to only raise more questions. With each new piece of the puzzle they uncovered, the workers found themselves drawn deeper into a mystery that was far older and more complex than they could have ever imagined. The pastor's words haunted them as they gathered in the church's basement, the air heavy with the musty scent of decay. It was as though the letter had placed a curse on the room. His words, "The darkness is coming, it will consume us all," seemed to echo off the stone walls, reverberating in the minds of the workers. What had happened here? Why had the town's entire population disappeared in the middle of the night without a trace? The letter spoke of something evil, something that had driven the people to leave. But what was this force? And why had it been hidden so carefully for so long? With the letter in hand, the workers made the decision to delve deeper into the mystery. They knew that they couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. But there was something else at play here, something beyond their comprehension. The town was not just abandoned. It was forsaken, as though its very existence had been erased from history. No one spoke of it. No one even mentioned its name. The local authorities had long since dismissed the disappearance as a simple case of a town that had packed up and left. But the workers now knew better. The truth, as they would soon learn, was far more complex and far more terrifying. The investigation led them beyond the church, to the heart of the town itself. They began to sift through the remaining buildings, those that had not succumbed entirely to decay. The general store was among the first they explored, its wooden shelves still standing, though empty and covered in layers of dust. There were remnants of old stock, abandoned goods that had once been staples of everyday life. Flour, sugar, canned vegetables, bottles of soda that had not been touched in years. But what struck them most about the store was the sense of desolation that hung in the air. The shelves had been left as they were, the product arranged in neat rows as though the store's owners had simply stepped away for a moment, never to return. Yet there were no personal items left behind, no photographs, no letters, no signs of human life. The store was a ghost of its former self, its only inhabitants now the shadows of the past. The same eerie feeling hung over the town's other buildings, the schoolhouse, the post office, the homes. All were in a similar state, frozen in time. The streets were empty, and the only sound that could be heard was the wind whispering through the cracked windows and fallen branches. Yet, despite the silence, the town felt alive, alive with the remnants of memories, of lives once lived, now reduced to dust and forgotten stories. It was as though the town itself had become a vessel for the darkness that the pastor had written about, a place that had been consumed by an evil force that had erased all traces of its people. As the days passed, the workers began to uncover more clues, old photographs, handwritten letters, and personal belongings that hinted at the lives of the town's vanished residents. But it was in the schoolhouse, of all places, that they made their most chilling discovery. Tucked away in the back of the building, hidden behind a false wall, they found a collection of old journals. These journals, unlike the pastor's letter, were not written in fear, but in the quiet desperation of people who had no other choice but to document their experiences. The journals were filled with strange accounts of people hearing voices in night, of strange figures appearing in the woods, of a growing sense of dread that seemed to take root in the hearts of the townspeople. The entries were scattered and fragmented, but a common theme began to emerge. A force, something unknown and dark, had descended upon the town. It was driving people mad. One journal, in particular, stood out. It was written by a woman named Margaret, whose handwriting was careful, precise, and filled with an almost eerie calm. She wrote of the strange occurrences that had begun to plague the town, describing a shift in the atmosphere that could not be explained. "There is something in the air," she wrote. "Something that clings to you, wraps itself around your mind until you cannot think straight. The woods are no longer safe, and the people, they are changing. I have seen it in their eyes. They are not the same." Margaret spoke of the pastor's growing instability, of the fear that had taken hold of the town's people, and of the terrifying visions that some of them had begun to experience. But it was her final entry that sent a chill through the workers. "I do not know what will happen next," she wrote, "but I feel in my bones. The town is dying, and whatever is coming, it is not something we can stop." The entry was the final one in the journal, and the words hung in the air like a warning, a message from the past that was too chilling to ignore. The workers had uncovered yet another piece of the puzzle, but it raised even more questions. What had Margaret meant by "the town is dying"? And what was the force that had consumed the town, driving its people to madness and ultimately to flee? They knew that the answers were within reach, but they also knew that uncovering those answers might not lead them to the closure they sought. There was a fear growing inside them, a fear that whatever had taken hold of this town was still here, still lingering beneath the surface. The team's next step was to try and piece together the stories they had uncovered. They began to research the history of the town and its people, hoping that by understanding the town's past, they could shed light on the dark forces that had driven the population to abandon it. But what they found was equally disturbing. The town had once been a thriving community, home to a number of families who had lived there for generations. The town's founding was unremarkable. A group of settlers who had found a peaceful spot to build their homes, create families, and establish roots. But as they dug deeper, they began to uncover strange gaps in the town's history. There were no records of any major events in the town's history. No significant births, no marriages, no deaths recorded after the 1940s. It was as though the entire town had simply disappeared from the annals of history. The workers were beginning to realize that they were not just dealing with a town that had been abandoned. They were dealing with a town that had been erased. The people had vanished, and any record of them had been wiped from existence. And yet, the town itself remained, standing as a silent monument to the unknown, to the dark forces that had consumed it. But as they continued their investigation, they began to notice something else, something that was far more unsettling than any of the discoveries they had made so far. The more they uncovered, the more they began to feel as though they were being watched. It started small, an inexplicable feeling that someone was standing just outside their line of sight, the hair on the back of their necks prickling with unease. But as the days passed, the feeling intensified. They began to hear strange noises, footsteps when no one was there, doors creaking open in the dead of night. And then, one night, something happened that would change everything. They were working late in the church, piecing together the final bits of the mystery, when they heard a loud crash from the direction of the basement. They rushed down to find that one of the old shelves had fallen, scattering books and artifacts across the floor. But it wasn't the fallen shelf that unsettled them. It was the sight of the dust-covered floor, which had been disturbed as though something or someone had walked through it. The footprints were faint but unmistakable. They led to the far corner of the room, where the hidden door had once been sealed. The team stared at the footprints, their minds racing. The door had been opened by them, and no one had been in the basement for hours. Yet there they were, footprints in the dust, leading into the darkness. Fear gripped them. Had they disturbed something that should have remained buried? Had they awakened the darkness that had consumed the town all those years ago? The questions flooded their minds, but the answer was elusive, slipping further away with each passing moment. All they knew for certain was that the town's mystery was far from over. It was just beginning. And as the night stretched on, they knew that the answers they sought would not come easily. Whatever had been unleashed in this place was not finished. It was still watching, still waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And the workers, now fully aware that they were tangled in a web far beyond their control, could only wonder how much further they would have to go before the darkness revealed its true face. The discovery of the footprints in the dust marked a turning point for the workers. It was no longer just a matter of restoring an old town or uncovering the mysteries of its past. Something more unsettling, more dangerous, was at play. The oppressive atmosphere that had once seemed like the mere weight of history now felt like an active force, one that was watching, waiting, and perhaps even reacting to their presence. The workers could no longer shake the sense that they had unearthed something far darker than any of them had ever imagined. The town was no longer a quiet relic of the past. It had become a living, breathing entity, one that was actively resisting their intrusion. They gathered in the church, their faces pale and drawn, each of them struggling to process the events that unfolded. The footprints in the dust were not the work of any of them. There was no explanation for how they had appeared. The last time they had left the basement, it had been untouched. No one had entered the room, yet the footprints led straight to the very place where the hidden door had been. And the unsettling feeling that had slowly crept into their hearts, the feeling that they were being watched, had grown into a palpable presence. It was as though the very walls of the town were closing in on them. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken fears. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, each of them wondering if the others were feeling the same suffocating weight of dread. It wasn't just the footprints that had them rattled. It was the overwhelming sense that they had crossed some invisible line, that they had disturbed something that should have remained hidden, buried deep within the town's dark history. Finally, Sarah, the archaeologist, broke the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. "We need to get out of here. We've uncovered something we're not supposed to find." Her words were met with nods of agreement, but no one moved. They were trapped between the urge to flee and the gnawing compulsion to uncover the truth. "I don't know," Peter, one of the workers, said slowly, his brow furrowed. "If we leave now, we'll never know what really happened. We can't stop now, not when we're so close." There was a fire in his voice, a desire to push forward that seemed to override the fear in his heart. But even as he spoke, he knew that continuing meant something far more dangerous than any of them had expected. The room was silent once more, the tension rising as each of them weighed the options before them. The feeling of being watched intensified, like invisible eyes were tracking every movement they made. It was suffocating, unbearable, and it seemed to seep into their thoughts, clouding their judgment. The strange sense of unease had escalated into something far more visceral, like a primal instinct telling them that they should turn back, that they were no longer welcome here. Yet they couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they sought were right beneath their feet, just out of reach. They knew that if they were to find those answers, they would need to go deeper into the town's past, deeper into the church's hidden secrets. But the question now was, were they willing to face whatever lay ahead, even if it meant confronting the darkness that had once consumed the town? In the days that followed, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The team continued their investigation, despite the growing anxiety that gripped them all. The town, once abandoned and forgotten, now seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The creaking of the old buildings, the whispers that seemed to follow them from the shadows. It all felt like a warning. Yet, despite the fear that gnawed at their edges, they pressed on. They had come too far to turn back now. They returned to the basement, hoping that the footprints had been some kind of illusion or a trick of the mind. But when they opened the door and stepped into the room, they were greeted by the same oppressive atmosphere, the same heavy silence. The footprints were gone. There was no trace of them, no sign that they had ever existed. It was as if the room had erased them, as if the town itself had decided that it would not allow the truth to come to light. And yet, something had changed. The air was thicker, heavier, as though the very walls were closing in on them. The workers felt a pressure building in their chests, a suffocating weight that made it harder to breathe. The oppressive silence that had once been a hallmark of the town now felt like an active force, one that was bearing down on them, warning them to stop, to leave before it was too late. But they didn't listen. They couldn't. Peter, with his relentless curiosity, led the charge. He moved to the far side of the room, to the corner where the strange artifacts had been found. The jars filled with glowing liquids, the odd masks, the bizarre tools. They were all still there, undisturbed. But something about them felt different now. They no longer seemed like mere relics of forgotten time. They seemed like objects of power, as though they'd been imbued with a malevolent force. Peter's fingers hovered over the objects, as though drawn to them by an unseen force. But Sarah, who had been watching him closely, grabbed his arm, pulling him away. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something about these objects. I don't think we should touch them." But Peter was undeterred. His curiosity, his need for answers, overpowered his fear. "We're here to understand what happened," he said, his voice tight with determination. "We need to know what these things are." With that, he reached for one of the jars, its surface slick with age, its liquid glowing faintly in the dark. The moment his fingers brushed the glass, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A sudden chill ran down his spine, and the air around him grew heavier, more oppressive. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out from the sheer weight of it. "Peter, stop!" Sarah cried, but it was too late. The moment his hand made contact with the jar, the air seemed to crackle with energy, and a low, almost imperceptible hum began to emanate from the object around them. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate deep within their bones, a low-frequency hum that was both unsettling and hypnotic. The workers froze, their bodies tense as the hum grew louder, louder until it felt like the very walls of the room were vibrating. Then, without warning, the floor beneath them seemed to shift. The ground rumbled, the building groaning in protest as if it were alive. The team stumbled, trying to keep their balance as the room swayed, the floorboards creaking and popping beneath their feet. It was as if the entire town were awakening, as though the very ground had been disturbed by their presence. The hum intensified, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and grow, twisting into shapes that couldn't be explained. "Get out!" Sarah shouted, pulling Peter away from the jars. "We've awakened something. We need to leave now." But as they turned to flee, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The air became suffocating, thick with an unseen force that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Panic set in as the workers scrambled to find a way out, their hearts pounding in their chests. They tried the door, but it was locked tight. The walls seemed closing on them, the shadows shifting and moving with a life of their own. And then, from somewhere deep within the church, they heard it, a low, guttural sound like a growl, rising from the depth of the earth. It was as though something was awakening beneath them, something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. The workers knew that they were no longer dealing with a simple mystery. They had awakened something far darker, something that had been lying in wait for decades. And now, the town had decided it was time for them to pay the price. The humming grew louder, and the shadows in the room twisted more violently. The workers were trapped, and the only thing that remained was a terrifying realization that the answers they had sought so desperately had come at a cost. The town was not abandoned because of some natural disaster or simple misfortune. The town had been abandoned because it had been claimed by something far more sinister, something that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now that the workers had disturbed it, they would be forced to confront the dark force that had taken hold of the town so many years ago. As the hum grew louder and the shadows pressing on them, the workers understood the gravity of their mistake. They had uncovered the town's dark secret, but it was a secret that had been meant to stay buried. And now, as the air thickened with the presence of something ancient and malevolent, they realized that they were not just fighting for answers. They were fighting for their lives. The situation inside the basement grew more surreal by the second, as the very air seemed to warp and shift. The oppressive hum that vibrated through walls was no longer just a distant noise. It was a physical presence, pressing against the workers' minds, making it harder to think, to breathe. The shadows that had once been mere tricks of light were now thick, twisting, and alive. They slithered across the floor, reaching out with unnatural movements, as though they had their own consciousness, their own hunger. Peter was the first to break free from the paralyzing shock that had overtaken them all. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog that clouded his thoughts, and looked around the room in panic. His eyes darted from one corner to the other, unable to fix on a single thing for too long. The shadows seemed to shift every time he tried to focus, warping into grotesque shapes that twisted and stretched, flickering like flames in the wind. It was as if the entire room had become a living organism, pulsating with an energy that was both ancient and primal. "Sarah!" Peter's voice cracked through the air. He turned to find the archaeologist, her face ashen, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of the madness around them. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But Sarah was frozen, her eyes fixed on the dark corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather, thickening like smoke. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was as though she were in a trance, drawn to something unseen. Peter grabbed her by the arm, trying to pull her away, but she resisted. Her eyes were wide with terror, but also filled with something else, a kind of recognition, as though she had seen this before, or had always known it was coming. She turned slowly to face Peter, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not over, Peter," she said, her words heavy with an unnatural gravity. "It's just beginning." Her words sent a chill down Peter's spine, and for a moment he wasn't sure she was still entirely herself. There was something strange in her gaze, something that had shifted, as though she had seen something in the shadows that had changed her. But before he could say anything, a guttural growl rumbled from the depths of the church, vibrating through the floor and into their bones. The sound was low and primal, echoing with an ancient fury that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath them. It was the sound of something waking up, stretching after a long slumber. Peter didn't wait another second. He yanked Sarah forward, pushed her toward the stairs, but the air in the basement had become thick, almost viscous, and each step was a struggle. It felt as though the walls themselves were resisting them, pressing it on them from all sides, holding them in place. The sound of the growl grew louder, more intense, and with it came an overwhelming feeling of dread. They were no longer just trapped in a room. They were trapped in the town itself, the very land under their feet seemingly coming alive to prevent their escape. As they made their way to the stairs, the temperature in the basement plummeted. The air grew cold enough to see their breath, a sharp, biting cold that clung to their skin. It was as though they were walking into the mouth of something hungry, something that had been waiting for years, centuries even, for the right moment to claim its due. And now, with their discovery, that moment had arrived. The rest of the workers were scattered throughout the basement, their faces pale with fear. Some had tried to run toward the stairs, but the same oppressive force that had pinned Sarah to the floor now held them back. They were fighting against something they didn't understand, and the more they struggled, the more it felt as though the very town itself was fighting them back. One of the workers, a man named Chris, shouted in fear as he stumbled into the wall, his hands pressed against the stone in desperation. "It's alive!" he cried. "It's alive!" His voice echoed in the basement, bouncing off the walls, but there was no answer. No voice, no reassurance. Just a growl, and then a silence that was so deep it seemed to consume everything. In that silence, the workers realized that the darkness wasn't just a presence. It was part of the land itself. It had seeped into the very bones of the town, a malevolent force that had waited for decades, centuries even, to be awakened. And now that it had been stirred, it would not let them leave so easily. Peter's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing for a way out. He tried to force his way up the stairs, pulling Sarah behind him, but the moment he reached for the door, the handle slipped from his grasp, as though it had been lubricated with something slick. It was as though the door itself was rejecting him, keeping him from escaping. Panic surged in his chest. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay in this place where the very walls seemed to breathe, where the shadows moved with life of their own. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and Peter's stomach twisted with fear. He turned to Sarah, who had now completely lost herself to the pull of the darkness. Her eyes were vacant, distant, as though she had been consumed by something that she couldn't fight. The woman who had once been calm and methodical in her research now stood before him, a hollow shell of the person she had been. And in that moment, Peter understood. This wasn't just a ghost story or a supernatural occurrence. It was something far worse. This town had been cursed, marked by an ancient evil that had claimed it, devoured it whole, and now sought to claim them as well. Peter didn't know what to do. Every instinct told him to run, to escape. But the town itself had become a prison, the land now alive with an overwhelming malevolence that pressed down on him like a vice. As he desperately tugged at the door, Sarah let out a strangled gasp. Peter spun around to see her reaching toward the center of the room, her eyes locked on something in the dark. "What is it?" Peter shouted, but Sarah didn't respond. Her body trembled as she moved toward the shadows, drawn in like a moth to a flame. He ran after her, desperate to stop her, but was as if she were no longer in control of her own actions. She stepped into the corner where the darkness seemed thickest, and as she did, the shadows seemed to swallow her whole. It was a moment that froze Peter's heart. One moment, she was standing there, looking lost. The next, she was gone, as though she had never existed in the first place. Peter reached the corner, his chest tight with panic, but there was no sign of her. She had vanished into thin air, absorbed by the shadows. He screamed her name, but there was no answer, no response, just the growing hum of the darkness around him. Desperation took hold of him as he stumbled back toward the door, his mind racing for a way to escape. But the door remained firmly locked, and every time he tried to turn the handle, it slipped from his hand. The growl now felt like it was vibrating inside his skull, rattling his bones, shaking his resolve. The oppressive weight of the town seemed to close in on him, and with it came an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The air was thick, saturated with dread, and every breath he took felt like it might be his last. It was then that he saw it, a flicker, a shadow in the distance, moving unnaturally fast. It wasn't a human figure. It was something else, something far darker. The shape shifted, elongated, and for a split second, Peter saw a pair of glowing eyes, cold and inhuman, staring at him from the depths of the basement. The figure lunged at him, its movement too fast to follow, and in that moment, Peter's world seemed to tilt. The basement walls seemed to collapse inward, and the shadows reached out like tendrils, grasping at him. The darkness closed on him, its grip unrelenting, and Peter realized with sickening clarity that he was not going to escape. He had awakened something that was far beyond his understanding, something that had been waiting for years to claim this town, and now it had claimed him too. He reached for the door one last time, but his hand slipped right through the handle, as though it had turned to liquid. His vision began to blur, and the shadows seemed to pulse, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. He was drowning in it, in the very essence of the town, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that there would be no escape. The town had claimed him, and it would never let him go. The feeling of being trapped inside the church, in the depths of the town, grew suffocating with every passing second. Peter's vision blurred, and the pounding of his heart echoed in his ears. It was as though time itself had become disjointed, fractured, spinning out of control. He could no longer distinguish between the shadows that pressed against him and the swirling thoughts that seemed to pull him into a void. The town, the church, the very land beneath his feet. It was as if they had all become one, a single entity that pulsed with a terrifying energy. Every movement, every breath, felt like it was being dictated by something far more powerful than him. Peter's eyes darted around the room in a frantic search for any sign of escape, but the walls were closing in, the shadows pressing forward, as though the very space itself was alive. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the corner, where Sarah had disappeared into the darkness. Her absence weighed heavily on him. She had been consumed by the shadows, swallowed up like she was nothing more than a passing thought. Her once steadfast determination to uncover the truth had now been replaced by something far more terrifying, a deep, silent surrender to the dark force that seemed to rule the town.